The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on the reliability of its morning rituals, and none was more sacred than the arrival of the post. For 32 years, Walter Finch had wheeled his red bicycle through the same winding lanes at precisely the same times, his leather satchel bulging with letters, parcels, and the small but vital communications that kept village life flowing as smoothly as the stream that ran behind the church. On the morning of December the 23rd, however, Walter Finch did not arrive. Miss Jane Marple noticed this absence with the quiet precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the subtle variations in human behavior. She sat in her customary chair by the sitting-room window, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a sensible grey scarf for her nephew Raymond. The morning was bitter cold, with that peculiar stillness that comes before snow, and frost had painted delicate ferns across her window panes. Through the lace curtains, she could see the village beginning its daily routine. Mrs. Bantry's gardener wrestling with a holly wreath, the vicar wheeling his bicycle toward the church, smoke rising thin and straight from cottage chimneys in the still air. But at 9:15, when Walter's cheerful whistle should have announced his arrival at her gate, there was only silence. "Most unusual," Miss Marple murmured to herself, setting down her knitting with a small frown. Walter Finch was a man of rigid habits, the sort who considered punctuality a moral virtue. She recalled the dreadful winter of 1947, when snow had blocked the main road for 3 days, and Walter had still managed to deliver the post on foot, arriving at each house with his cheeks red from cold, but his schedule intact. The unease that settled in Miss Marple's chest was not dramatic. Merely a small, cold certainty that something in the village's careful pattern had gone awry. It was the same feeling she'd experienced years ago when the church organist had suddenly begun playing hymns in minor keys, 2 weeks before the discovery that he'd been helping himself to the collection money. By 10 o'clock, the absence of the Morning Post had become a topic of general concern throughout St. Mary Mead. In the high street, shopkeepers stood in their doorways, peering down the lane as if their collective attention might summon Walter's familiar figure. At the Blue Boar, the early patrons had gathered around the fireplace, their conversation growing increasingly speculative. "Still no sign of him," announced Major Palgrave, tapping his empty pipe against the hearth with irritation. "I'm expecting an important letter from my solicitor. Damned inconvenient timing." Tom Ginch, the landlord, polished a tankard with unnecessary vigor. "Likely held up at the sorting office in Much Benham," he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Christmas rush and all, mountains of parcels to sort through." "Walter Finch has never been late, in all the years I've known him," observed Dr. Haydock from his corner table, where he was nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "The man treats his rounds like a military operation. Something must have happened." In the opposite corner, a young woman with striking red hair and an anxious expression looked up sharply. This was Clara Mallow, recently returned from London under circumstances that had provided the village gossips with weeks of delicious speculation. "Perhaps he's had an accident," she suggested, her voice tight with worry. "Those lanes near Miller's Copse can be treacherous with black ice." "Don't be morbid, Clara," Tom snapped, perhaps too quickly. "He's probably just stopped to chat with Mrs. Bantry about her prize roses. You know how she can talk." But Clara's fingers drummed nervously against her glass of sherry. She wasn't waiting for Christmas cards or bills. She was waiting for something far more important. A letter that would determine whether she could remain in St. Mary Mead or would be forced to flee before the new year arrived. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had decided that a constitutional walk might be beneficial for her health. She donned her heavy tweed coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around her neck, and picked up her shopping basket. It was time to visit the chemist for some throat lozenges, she decided, and if her route happened to take her past the post office and along the road toward Walter's cottage, that was merely sensible planning. The morning air was sharp enough to make her eyes water, and her breath formed small clouds as she walked. The village seemed unusually quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. She passed the doctor's surgery, noting that his motor car remained in the drive, unusual for a Monday morning when he typically made his rounds. She passed the imposing gates of Gossington Hall, where Colonel and Mrs. Bantry lived, the ironwork gleaming with frost. It was as she approached the old stone bridge that crossed the stream at the village's edge that she saw something that made her stop abruptly. A bicycle, Walter's distinctive red post office bicycle, lay on its side in the shallow ditch beside the bridge. The front wheel was twisted at an odd angle, and the large canvas bag that should have contained the morning's deliveries hung empty from the handlebars, its contents scattered across the frozen ground like fallen leaves. Miss Marple approached slowly, her trained eye taking in every detail. There were no skid marks on the frost-slicked road, no signs of a collision or struggle. The bicycle appeared to have been placed, rather than fallen, positioned just out of sight of casual passers-by. But it was what lay beneath the bridge, on the muddy bank of the stream, that confirmed her worst fears. Walter Finch lay face down among the frost-stiffened reeds, his postman's uniform dark against the pale earth. His cap had fallen a few feet away, and his right hand was outstretched toward the water as if reaching for something that had floated beyond his grasp. Scattered around him were dozens of envelopes and small parcels, Christmas cards, bills, personal letters, the vital communications of village life now sodden and ruined. Miss Marple stood very still for a long moment, her mind automatically cataloguing the scene. The position of the body suggested Walter had been struck from behind. The scattered post indicated someone had been searching for something specific among his deliveries. Most telling of all, there was no sign that Walter had attempted to defend himself. He had trusted his attacker enough to turn his back. "Oh dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of the stream. Poor Walter. Someone was very determined indeed to prevent a particular letter from reaching its destination. She turned back toward the village, her step purposeful but unhurried. The police would need to be summoned immediately, and Inspector Slack would no doubt arrive from Much Benham with his usual bluster and impatience. But as she walked, Miss Marple's mind was already working, examining the implications of what she had discovered. Walter Finch had been murdered not for money or passion, but for information. Someone in St. Mary Mead had killed to prevent a letter from being delivered, which meant that somewhere in her quiet village, a secret existed dangerous enough to be worth a man's life. The silence that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt ominous, heavy with unspoken truths. Christmas was only 2 days away, but Miss Marple suspected that before the holiday bells rang, St. Mary Mead would be forced to confront some very uncomfortable revelations about the true nature of its inhabitants. She quickened her pace slightly, her mind already turning over the possibilities. In her long experience, murder was rarely as simple as it first appeared, and the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in the most ordinary places. The game, as her nephew Raymond would say, with his fondness for detective stories, was indeed afoot. Inspector Slack arrived with his customary lack of subtlety, his black motor car grinding to a halt beside the stone bridge with unnecessary force. He emerged from the vehicle like a man perpetually irritated by the inconvenience of other people's misfortunes, his heavy overcoat flapping in the bitter morning air. Miss Marple remained seated on the low garden wall where she had positioned herself after summoning the police, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she observed the proceedings with the mild attention of someone watching a mildly interesting theatrical performance. "Miss Marple," Slack acknowledged tersely, pulling out his notebook with a sharp snap. "I understand you discovered the body." "Indeed, Inspector," she replied with gentle precision. "I was taking my constitutional when I noticed Walter's bicycle in rather an unusual position. Such a conscientious man, Walter, never one to abandon his duties carelessly." Slack scribbled notes with aggressive efficiency, while Dr. Haydock emerged from beneath the bridge, his medical bag in hand and his expression appropriately grave. "Blunt force trauma to the posterior cranium," the doctor reported with clinical detachment. Heavy implement wielded with considerable force. Death would have been instantaneous. "Time of death?" Slack demanded. "Between 7 and 9 this morning, I'd estimate. Rigor mortis suggests closer to 8 o'clock. Meanwhile, the news had begun its inevitable journey through St. Mary Mead with the speed and thoroughness that only village gossip could achieve. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley held court among the morning shoppers, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of one who delighted in being first with catastrophic news. "Murdered, you mark my words," she announced with grim relish. His post bag emptied, letters scattered everywhere. Someone was searching for something specific. In my day, postmen were respected figures. Now we have vagrants and strangers lurking about, taking advantage of decent folk. Young Clara Mallow, who had been examining tins of soup with unusual concentration, dropped her shopping basket with a clatter that drew every eye in the shop. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her face draining of color. "The news is rather shocking." "Naturally, dear," Mrs. Hart said kindly, though her eyes remained sharp with curiosity. "Such a terrible thing to happen so close to Christmas." At the Blue Boar, the morning's cheerful atmosphere had evaporated entirely. Tom Ginch polished glasses with mechanical repetition, his usual joviality replaced by nervous energy. The few early patrons spoke in hushed tones, their conversations punctuated by meaningful glances and uncomfortable silences. "Police will want to speak with everyone who saw Walter yesterday," Major Palgrave observed, tapping his pipe against the hearth. "Routine inquiries, of course, but still rather unsettling." Clara Mallow, seated alone near the frosted window, gripped her teacup with white knuckles. When Solicitor Mr. Abbott entered, shaking snow from his coat, she started visibly. "They're saying the killer was searching through the post," Abbott announced to the room at large, "looking for something particular by all accounts." The teacup slipped from Clara's trembling fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound like a pistol shot. "Nerves," she whispered, kneeling to gather the pieces with shaking hands. "Just nerves." Back at the crime scene, Miss Marple had noticed several details that Inspector Slack's more direct approach had overlooked. The scattered correspondence revealed a fascinating cross-section of village life. Bills from London firms, personal letters in familiar handwritings, and several envelopes whose addresses had been deliberately obscured by mud and water. "Curious how selectively the post was scattered," she observed mildly to Constable Polk. "Almost as if someone knew precisely what they were seeking." Inspector Slack, overhearing, turned with barely concealed irritation. "Random vandalism, most likely. Criminals aren't known for their organizational skills." "Of course not, Inspector," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though I do find it interesting that Walter's wallet remained untouched in his jacket pocket. Thieves are usually rather more thorough about such obvious targets." As the morning progressed, the village began to turn inward upon itself with the inevitable suspicion that follows violent crime in small communities. Neighbors eyed each other with new wariness, searching familiar faces for signs of guilt or deception. The comfortable rhythms of daily life had been shattered as thoroughly as Clara Mallow's teacup. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return home, her mind already cataloguing the morning's observations. Someone in St. Mary Mead had committed murder to prevent a letter from reaching its intended recipient, and that someone was very likely among the shocked, concerned faces she had observed throughout the morning, wearing an expression of innocent horror while their conscience burned with guilty knowledge. The investigation had only just begun, but already the careful facade of village respectability was beginning to crack. The morning after Walter Finch's murder dawned grey and bitter, with a thin coating of frost that made the village lanes treacherous and the tragedy at the bridge seem even more stark against the winter landscape. Miss Marple sat in her comfortable sitting room, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a pair of mittens for the church bazaar, when Mary announced that Mr. Ginch from the Blue Boar wished to speak with her. Tom Ginch entered with his cap in his hands and an expression of barely concealed anxiety. His usual jovial manner had been replaced by the nervous energy of a man carrying an uncomfortable burden. Miss Marple invited him to sit and rang for tea, understanding that people often found it easier to speak difficult truths with something warm to occupy their hands. "Terrible business about Walter," Tom began, fidgeting with his cap brim. "I keep thinking about yesterday morning when he stopped in for his usual cup of tea. Something wasn't right with him, Miss Marple. He kept checking his watch, glancing toward the door like he was expecting trouble." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "Did he mention anything specific that was troubling him?" "That's just it. He asked me something peculiar. Wanted to know if anyone had been inquiring about registered post or special deliveries. Said he'd noticed someone had been asking questions around the village, but he wouldn't say who." Tom's voice dropped to an anxious whisper. Then he finished his tea in a terrible hurry and left. That would have been about 7:20. After Tom departed, Miss Marple sat quietly for several minutes, her mind working over the implications of his visit. Something had been troubling Walter Finch in his final hours, something connected to the post he carried. But there was another detail that nagged at her methodical mind, a question of timing that Inspector Slack's more direct approach had overlooked entirely. If Walter had died at approximately 8 o'clock, as Dr. Haydock estimated, and he had left the Blue Boar at 7:20, then he should have been well into his rounds by the time he met his killer. The stone bridge was at the very beginning of his route, not the middle. For Walter to have been at the bridge at 8 meant he had been delayed somewhere between the pub and the village proper, delayed by someone or something that had cost him his life. Dr. Haydock's arrival at 11:30 provided another piece of the increasingly complex puzzle. The doctor accepted whiskey rather than tea and stood by the window with the restless energy of a man troubled by professional obligations. "I've been wrestling with my conscience since yesterday," he said abruptly. "Walter came to see me 2 evenings ago, after surgery hours. Most unusual behavior for him." The doctor turned from the window, his expression grave. "He wanted to ask me about certain substances, hypothetically, he insisted, that might cause symptoms resembling natural illness. When I pressed him for details, he became quite agitated and said he'd observed something during his rounds that made him fear someone in the village was in danger." Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful attention. "Did he specify who might be at risk?" "He refused to say. Claimed he needed to gather more evidence before making accusations. I advised him to contact the police if he had genuine concerns, but Walter insisted on proceeding carefully." Dr. Haydock drained his whiskey in one swallow. "Now I can't help wondering if that conversation sealed his fate." The afternoon brought Inspector Slack's expected visit, though his manner suggested he considered the interview a mere formality. He seated himself with obvious reluctance and consulted his notebook with the air of a man going through necessary but tedious motions. "We're proceeding on the assumption of robbery," he announced without preamble. "Finch surprised someone rifling through the post bag, struck down in the ensuing struggle. Yet his wallet remained untouched," Miss Marple observed mildly, "and much of the correspondence was left scattered where it fell. Rather selective behavior for a common thief, wouldn't you say?" Slack's expression suggested he found such observations tiresome. "Criminals aren't known for their logical thinking, Miss Marple. I'd advise against spreading theories about mysterious letters and village secrets. People are nervous enough without adding fuel to the gossip mill." After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple took her afternoon constitutional through the village, ostensibly to purchase stamps at the post office, but actually to observe the subtle currents of fear and suspicion that were beginning to flow beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Outside the solicitor's office, she witnessed a heated exchange between Clara Mallow and Mr. Abbott that provided yet another thread in the increasingly tangled web. Clara stood on the pavement, her red hair vivid against the grey stone, her posture one of desperate pleading. "The document was supposed to arrive yesterday," she was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "If it's lost, If it was in Walter's bag, then we must wait for a replacement from London, Abbott replied with professional detachment. The terms of your uncle's will were quite specific, Miss Mallow. If the inheritance documents are not signed and filed by Christmas Eve, the entire estate reverts to the charitable trust. Clara's face contorted with an emotion that went far beyond mere disappointment. You don't understand, she whispered. I can't wait. There are people who would do anything to prevent me from claiming what's rightfully mine. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind catalogued the day's revelations with the systematic precision of a naturalist organizing specimens. Walter Finch had been investigating something sinister, something that had made him fear for someone's safety. He had been asking about registered post and special deliveries. Clara Mallow's financial future hung on documents that should have been in Walter's bag. And somewhere in the village, a killer was growing increasingly desperate as the investigation began to uncover secrets that had been carefully buried. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that patience and careful observation would eventually reveal the truth, no matter how cleverly it had been concealed. The village meeting convened that evening in the parish hall carried all the solemnity of a wake and twice the tension. Word had spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency that only genuine crisis could inspire, and by 7 o'clock nearly every adult resident had gathered in the drafty space, their faces bearing expressions of curiosity, fear, and barely concealed suspicion. Miss Marple arrived early, positioning herself near the back where she could observe the assembled faces without appearing to do so. Her knitting bag rested in her lap, though her needles remained still as she catalogued the subtle signs of anxiety that permeated the room like incense. Clara Mallow sat, rigidly upright, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Major Palgrave kept checking his pocket watch with nervous frequency. Mrs. Price Ridley wore an expression of grim satisfaction as though vindicated in some long-held suspicion about the moral decline of modern society. Inspector Slack entered with his customary lack of ceremony, accompanied by Constable Polk, who carried himself with the uncomfortable dignity of a man thrust into circumstances beyond his usual scope. The inspector's announcement was characteristically blunt. "This is a murder investigation," he began without preamble. "Walter Finch was killed while carrying out his duties, and his post-bag was deliberately searched. I need to know who was expecting correspondence yesterday morning, particularly anything of value or importance." The silence that followed was pregnant with calculation. Miss Marple watched as eyes darted between neighbors, each person weighing the risk of revelation against the greater risk of concealment. Clara Mallow stood first, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was expecting legal documents from London, inheritance papers that needed to be filed before Christmas Eve." She glanced toward Mr. Abbott, who nodded confirmation from his position near the door. Major Palgrave cleared his throat with military precision. "Bank correspondence," he admitted tersely. "Nothing that would interest anyone else." But Miss Marple noticed how he avoided his wife's anxious gaze and how Mrs. Palgrave's face had gone quite pale. Mrs. Price Ridley's contribution came with characteristic self-righteousness. "Family letters from Birmingham," she declared, "though I can't imagine why anyone would be interested in my personal affairs." It was then that Constable Polk stepped forward, his expression grave. "Inspector, we've made a discovery that changes things considerably." He produced a heavy object wrapped in brown paper, unwrapping it with ceremonial care to reveal an ornate brass candlestick, its base darkened with what was unmistakably dried blood. A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. The candlestick was distinctive, part of a Victorian set that anyone familiar with Gossington Hall would recognize immediately. "This was found buried near the crime scene," Slack announced, his satisfaction evident. "Dr. Haydock confirms it's consistent with the murder weapon." Colonel Bantry rose slowly, his face flushed with indignation. "That's from my morning room. he said loudly. "But if you think We'll need to speak with everyone who visited Gossington Hall yesterday morning," Slack interrupted. "This is now evidence in a murder case." Miss Marple observed the ripple of reaction that passed through the assembled villagers. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and she noted that Clara Mallow had gone quite still, her earlier nervousness replaced by something that looked remarkably like relief. After the meeting dissolved into anxious clusters of conversation, Miss Marple made her way home through the bitter evening air, her mind working methodically through the implications of what she had witnessed. The candlestick was clearly planted evidence. Too convenient, too obvious, too perfectly designed to implicate Colonel Bantry. But the planter had made a crucial error in assuming that obvious guilt would satisfy Inspector Slack's investigation. More intriguing was Clara Mallow's reaction to the discovery. The young woman's relief had been palpable, as though the focus on the candlestick had lifted some terrible weight from her shoulders. Miss Marple reflected on the inheritance documents that had finally arrived, on Clara's desperate need to file them before Christmas Eve, and on the curious timing of both the murder and the planted evidence. As she reached her garden gate, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hedge. Peter Lake, the nervous young assistant from the post office, approached with the hesitant manner of someone bearing uncomfortable news. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "There's something about yesterday morning that I think you should know. Something about what Walter was really carrying in his bag." Miss Marple invited him in for tea, understanding that the evening's revelations were merely the prelude to deeper truths. The candlestick might have satisfied Inspector Slack's need for evidence, but it had also revealed something far more significant: that someone in St. Mary Mead was clever enough to commit murder and cunning enough to frame an innocent man for it. The real investigation, she realized, was only just beginning. And somewhere in the village, a killer was watching the proceedings with satisfaction, believing they had successfully misdirected attention from their true crime. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew that the most carefully constructed deceptions often contained the seeds of their own destruction. The game was becoming considerably more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Peter Lake perched on the very edge of Miss Marple's chintz armchair, his postal uniform still bearing traces of snow from the evening's fall. His hands worked nervously at his cap brim, and when Mary brought in the tea tray, he started as though caught in some criminal act. Miss Marple poured with her customary calm precision, understanding that confessions, like delicate plants, required the proper atmosphere to flourish. "I wasn't entirely truthful with Inspector Slack," Peter began, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the registered post that Walter collected yesterday morning. There were several items that required special handling, and Walter was most particular about them." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, creating an atmosphere of domestic normalcy that seemed to ease the young man's distress. "Special items do require careful attention," she agreed mildly. "Walter was always so conscientious about his duties." Peter nodded vigorously, encouraged by her understanding tone. The first was Miss Mallow's inheritance documents from London, those heavy legal papers that arrived on the late train. Walter checked them twice before placing them in his official bag. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with nervous energy. But there were two other items that troubled him greatly. A registered letter for Major Palgrave from Lloyd's Bank, marked urgent, and a confidential package for Dr. Haydock from some agency in London. "And these items were never recovered from the scattered correspondence?" Miss Marple inquired, her needles never pausing. "That's precisely what's been keeping me awake, Miss Marple. Only Miss Mallow's documents were found among the scattered post, and those had been opened and hastily resealed. The other two items vanished completely." Peter's voice dropped to an anxious whisper. "Walter mentioned something odd that morning when he collected the post. He said there were some letters that were more dangerous than bombs if they fell into the wrong hands. After Peter departed into the snowy evening, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence, her mind arranging the new information with methodical precision. 3 items of crucial importance, but only one left behind by the killer, suggesting someone who knew exactly what they sought and had found it among Walter's correspondence. The following morning brought Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple's door, her usual composure replaced by indignant anxiety. "Arthur is being questioned again at the station," she announced without preamble. "That dreadful Inspector Slack seems convinced our candlestick makes him a murderer, though he can't even suggest a proper motive." "The candlestick is indeed puzzling," Miss Marple agreed, inviting her friend to sit by the fire. "When did you first notice it was missing from your morning room?" "2 days before poor Walter's death. I mentioned it to Tom Ginch when he delivered supplies that morning. He seemed quite concerned and offered to ask around the village." Mrs. Bantry paused, frowning. "Now that I think of it, his reaction was rather odd, almost as if he already knew something about it." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, then grew still. Tom Ginch had known the candlestick was missing before the murder occurred, yet he had been the first to suggest Walter was merely delayed rather than in danger. The implications were deeply troubling. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock outside the surgery, his usual professional composure replaced by obvious strain. When she mentioned the missing correspondence, his reaction confirmed her growing suspicions. "The package from London contained a report I'd commissioned," he admitted reluctantly. "I've been observing certain medical anomalies in the village, patterns of illness that didn't quite align with natural causes. Walter's questions about hypothetical poisons weren't as theoretical as I'd hoped." "And the subjects of your investigation, Doctor?" Haydock's face grew grave. "I cannot breach confidentiality without proof, but I will say this. One of the people I was investigating stood to gain significantly from a death that appeared entirely natural." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she encountered Clara Mallow near the bridge where Walter's body had been discovered. The young woman seemed drawn to the spot with morbid fascination, her red hair vivid against the grey stone. "I keep thinking about that morning," Clara said without preamble. "I was walking early, before anyone else was about, trying to clear my head about the inheritance business. I saw someone near the stream coming up from the bank just before I found Walter's bicycle. Did you recognize this person, my dear?" Clara hesitated, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "It was foggy, and I was quite distressed, but they walked with a pronounced limp, like Major Palgrave. They were carrying something under their arm, something wrapped in cloth." Miss Marple filed this information carefully, though she knew that eyewitness testimony in poor visibility was notoriously unreliable. More significant was Clara's continued nervousness, despite the successful delivery of her inheritance documents. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple's mind worked methodically through the accumulating evidence. Walter Finch had been carrying correspondence that threatened multiple people in St. Mary Mead. Clara's inheritance, Major Palgrave's financial ruin, and Dr. Haydock's investigation into potential poisoning. But it was Tom Ginch's foreknowledge of the missing candlestick that provided the most concrete link between the planted evidence and the actual crime. The pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Someone in the village had committed murder not for passion or greed, but to prevent the exposure of an even greater crime. The missing report from Dr. Haydock's investigation suggested that Walter's death might not be the only suspicious fatality in St. Mary Mead's recent history. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The killer had been clever enough to plant false evidence and ruthless enough to murder an innocent man, but they had also made several crucial errors. The most dangerous criminals, she reflected, were often those who believed themselves too intelligent to be caught. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, she was certain, and with Christmas Eve approaching, the pressure on the killer would intensify dramatically. The peaceful facade of village life had been permanently shattered, but truth, like spring after winter, would eventually emerge from beneath the carefully constructed deceptions. Christmas Eve morning dawned with the kind of crystalline brightness that made St. Mary Mead appear almost ethereally beautiful, snow transforming every cottage and lane into something from a fairy tale. Yet beneath this picturesque tranquility, Miss Marple sensed the village holding its collective breath, as if waiting for some final, decisive revelation that would either restore peace or shatter it completely. Her first visitor arrived before she had finished her morning tea. Mrs. Palgrave, looking haggard and desperate, her usual social composure entirely abandoned. The woman's hands shook as she accepted a cup of tea, and her voice trembled with the weight of confession. "I cannot remain silent any longer about my husband's situation," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush of relief and anxiety. "Arthur has been in terrible financial difficulties, gambling debts that accumulated over months of poor judgment. The letter from Lloyd's bank that Walter was carrying contained a final notice about his accounts." She paused, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "But here's what troubles me most, Miss Marple. When Arthur returned home that morning, he seemed relieved rather than distressed. He told me the letter had arrived safely and that arrangements had been made with his creditors." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "So your husband received his correspondence before Walter's death occurred?" "Yes, which means he had no reason to harm poor Walter. The damage to his reputation was already done, but at least he could begin making amends." Mrs. Palgrave's voice grew stronger with this realization. "Someone else had reason to search through that post bag, Miss Marple. Someone looking for something entirely different." After Mrs. Palgrave departed, Miss Marple reflected on this crucial piece of timing. Walter had completed at least part of his rounds before meeting his killer, which meant the murder wasn't about preventing delivery, but about retrieving something specific that had already been distributed or was still in his possession. The morning brought Peter Lake to her door once again, this time with information that cast the entire investigation in a new light. His nervous energy had transformed into something approaching excitement as he revealed what he had discovered in the postal records. "I've been reviewing the correspondence patterns from the past month," he said, producing a small notebook filled with careful observations. Walter was right to be suspicious about those anonymous letters. There were at least 6 of them, all supposedly from London, but actually posted from Much Benham. The paper was identical. The typing came from the same machine, and they were all sent to people in the village who had something to hide or lose. Miss Marple invited him to continue, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. Major Palgrave received investment advice that led to his financial troubles. Dr. Haydock got anonymous tips about suspicious deaths in the village. Clara Mallow received warnings about challenges to her inheritance. Even Colonel Bantry got letters questioning his wife's expenditures. Peter's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone was systematically gathering leverage over half the village, Miss Marple, and Walter figured out the pattern." The implications were staggering. Someone had been orchestrating a campaign of manipulation and blackmail, using anonymous correspondence to create vulnerability and dependence. Walter Finch, with his methodical attention to postal details, had begun to uncover this network of deception. Miss Marple's afternoon constitutional took her past the Blue Boar, where she encountered Tom Ginch sweeping the pavement with unnecessary vigor. His usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by watchful hostility, and when she paused to comment on the unusual warmth for December, his response was curt and evasive. "You seem troubled, Mr. Ginch," she observed with gentle concern. "Perhaps worried about the investigation? I understand Mrs. Bantry mentioned the missing candlestick to you several days before the murder occurred." Tom's broom clattered to the ground, his face flushing an alarming shade of red. "Don't know what you're suggesting," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "People talk, servants gossip, that's all it was." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though it's curious how often your name appears in connection with various village affairs. Mrs. Bantry's candlestick, Walter's questions about special deliveries, even serving as executor for several elderly residents who passed away recently. The effect was immediate and telling. Tom's hands clenched into fists, his entire posture shifting from defensive to threatening. "You'd best mind your own business, Miss Marple. This village has enough troubles without busybodies stirring up more." He retreated into the pub with obvious agitation, leaving Miss Marple with the certainty that she had struck very close to the truth. Tom Ginch was far more than a simple publican. He was the spider at the center of a web of manipulation and murder. The final piece of the puzzle came from Dr. Haydock, who arrived at her cottage that evening with a manila folder and an expression of grim determination. "I've been reviewing death certificates and medical records," he announced without preamble. 3 elderly residents died in the past year under circumstances I initially attributed to natural causes, but the pattern is deeply disturbing when examined collectively. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, giving him her complete attention. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Blackwood, and old Mrs. Carmichael all showed similar symptoms before death: gradual weakness, digestive troubles, eventual cardiac failure. Individually, these seemed consistent with advanced age and natural decline. Dr. Haydock opened the folder, revealing medical notes and correspondence. But when I investigated further, I discovered that Tom Ginch had been granted power of attorney for all 3, ostensibly to help manage their affairs as they became increasingly frail. "And their estates, Doctor. Modest but collectively substantial. Each will named Tom as executor, with generous fees for his services. More significantly, each estate required probate proceedings that Tom handled personally, giving him access to all their financial information and legal documents." Haydock's voice grew heavy with implication. "I believe Tom Ginch has been systematically poisoning elderly residents for their money, using his position as a trusted member of the community to gain their confidence and access to their homes." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the calm precision of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. And Walter discovered this pattern during his rounds. Walter delivered my initial inquiry to a toxicology laboratory in London 3 weeks ago. He knew I was investigating suspicious deaths, and his questions about hypothetical poisons weren't theoretical at all. He was helping me gather evidence. Haydock closed the folder with decisive finality. The package that was stolen from his post bag contained the laboratory results that would have proven the poisonings conclusively. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her mind working through the complete picture that had finally emerged. Tom Ginch had been conducting a campaign of systematic murder, using anonymous letters to manipulate and blackmail other villagers, while slowly poisoning elderly residents for their modest estates. Walter Finch, with his methodical nature and intimate knowledge of village correspondence, had begun to notice the patterns that connected these seemingly separate crimes. The murder at the bridge had been an act of desperation, Tom killing Walter to prevent the exposure of his poisoning scheme and stealing the toxicology report that would have provided definitive proof. The scattered post, the planted candlestick, even the focus on Clara Mallow's inheritance had all been misdirection designed to conceal the true scope of his criminal enterprise. Miss Marple rose from her chair with sudden decision. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, but tonight there was still work to be done. Tom Ginch had proven himself capable of murder to protect his secrets, and with the investigation closing in, he would undoubtedly become even more dangerous. It was time to set a trap of her own, one that would finally expose the truth and bring justice for Walter, Finch, and his other victims. The peaceful facade of village life had been permanently shattered, but truth, like dawn after the longest night, would eventually illuminate even the darkest corners of human nature. Christmas Eve in St. Mary Mead would be remembered not for its beauty, but for the moment when a killer's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him, Christmas morning in St. Mary Mead arrived with crystalline beauty that seemed to mock the darkness lurking beneath the village's festive facade. Miss Marple attended the early service at St. Mary's, positioning herself where she could observe Tom Ginch's behavior with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades cataloging the subtle variations in human nature under stress. Tom sat rigidly in his customary pew, his hands gripping the prayer book with white-knuckled intensity. His eyes darted constantly around the congregation, searching for signs of suspicion or threat. When Inspector Slack entered during the opening hymn and took a seat near the back, Tom's shoulders visibly tensed, though he continued singing with mechanical precision. After the service, Miss Marple lingered near the lich gate, engaging Inspector Slack in conversation that was deliberately audible to the departing congregation. Her voice carried just the right note of concerned speculation as she discussed the investigation's progress. "Such a relief that you focused on Miss Mallow's inheritance troubles," she said clearly, ensuring Tom could overhear. "Her desperation about those documents does seem rather suspicious, doesn't it? And her mysterious circumstances in London before returning to the village." From her peripheral vision, Miss Marple caught Tom's reaction, the subtle loosening of tension in his posture, the slight nod of satisfaction. He believed the investigation was moving away from him, exactly as she had intended. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited several key figures to her cottage for what she described as a modest Christmas tea. Tom Ginch, Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack, and Clara Mallow gathered in her sitting room, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions and the weight of recent events. "I've been reflecting on poor Walter's final morning," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with steady hands, while her needles rested nearby. "Such a methodical man, devoted to his duties. It occurred to me that Walter possessed something far more dangerous than any document. He had knowledge of patterns, the sort of detailed observations that come from 30 years of faithful service." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his teacup rattling slightly against its saucer. "What sort of patterns? Walter was just a postman." "Ah, but postmen see everything, don't they? Who receives letters from whom? When registered post arrives, which elderly residents suddenly begin receiving correspondence from solicitors and banks?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, conversational. "Walter mentioned to Dr. Haydock that he'd observed something troubling during his rounds, something that made him fear for someone's safety." The silence in the room grew heavy. Clara Mallow looked puzzled, while Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his professional attention fully engaged. "Of course," Miss Marple continued, "Walter was particularly concerned about the anonymous letters that had been circulating through the village. Such an unusual pattern, all posted from Much Benham, but supposedly from London, all targeting people with secrets to hide." She paused to sip her tea delicately. He realized someone was systematically gathering information about vulnerable residents, using that knowledge to gain their trust and eventually their estates. Tom's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "That's pure speculation. Walter never said anything like that to me." "Didn't he?" Miss Marple's eyes met his with gentle directness. "How curious that you should know what Walter did or didn't say, Mr. Ginch. After all, you claimed to be busy in your cellar that morning, far too occupied to speak with him." Tom's composure cracked slightly. "I meant generally, over the weeks before. We all talked to Walter regularly." "Indeed. Though I find it interesting that Walter specifically asked you about registered post and special deliveries. Almost as if he suspected someone was monitoring the mail for particular items." Miss Marple set down her teacup with quiet finality. "Someone who would know exactly when inheritance documents or medical reports were due to arrive." "You're fishing," Tom said, but his voice had grown tight with strain. "Making wild accusations without proof." "Oh, but there is proof, Mr. Ginch. You see, Walter was far more careful than you realized. Before meeting his fate at the bridge, he made one final stop, at the church vestry, where he often left important items for safekeeping." This was Miss Marple's calculated bluff, delivered with such quiet certainty that it carried the weight of absolute truth. Tom shot to his feet, his face contorting with panic and rage. "That's impossible. I searched everywhere. His bag, his pockets, the ground around the bridge. There was nothing left." The words hung in the air like a confession. Inspector Slack rose slowly, his hand moving toward his handcuffs, while Tom realized with dawning horror what he had revealed. "Searched his pockets, did you?" Slack said grimly. "That's rather specific knowledge for an innocent man, Mr. Ginch." Tom's remaining composure shattered completely. He was going to ruin everything. Walter and his meddling questions, his suspicious looks every time I helped those old people with their affairs. They were grateful for my assistance. They told me so themselves. "Before you poisoned them," Dr. Haydock said coldly. "Before you slowly murdered them for their modest estates." As Constable Polk entered to make the arrest, Tom's final protest echoed through Miss Marple's sitting room. "They were dying anyway. I just made it easier for them, and they left their money to someone who'd been kind to them. Walter had no right to interfere." The case was closed through Tom's own words, his need to justify his actions ultimately betraying him more completely than any physical evidence could have done. Miss Marple resumed her knitting as the police led him away, reflecting that human nature, in all its complexity and weakness, remained the most reliable guide to truth she had ever encountered. Christmas afternoon settled peacefully over St. Mary Mead. Justice served, and the village's long nightmare finally ended. Boxing Day morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with the peculiar quality of a village awakening from a collective nightmare. The snow that had fallen during the night softened the harsh edges of recent events, blanketing the lanes in pristine white that seemed to promise a fresh beginning. Yet beneath this peaceful facade, the community struggled to absorb the shocking revelations about Tom Ginch and the systematic evil that had masqueraded as neighborly concern for nearly 2 years. Miss Marple received Inspector Slack in her sitting room with her customary grace, though she noted the unusual humility in his manner as he delivered his official report. The inspector settled into his chair with the stiff posture of someone acknowledging that his investigation had been thoroughly guided by insights he had initially dismissed. The full scope of Tom's crimes. "Tom Ginch has provided a complete confession," Slack announced, consulting his notebook with grim precision. 3 murders by systematic arsenic poisoning over 18 months, financial fraud totaling nearly £8,000, and the murder of Walter Finch to prevent exposure of his activities. The laboratory reports recovered from the church vestry had confirmed Dr. Haydock's worst suspicions. Walter had indeed hidden the crucial toxicology evidence behind the hymnal cabinet, ensuring that his death would not prevent justice from being served. The reports showed clear evidence of arsenic poisoning in the exhumed remains of Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Blackwood, and Mrs. Carmichael, 3 elderly residents who had trusted Tom Ginch with their lives and their estates. Tom's method had been diabolically patient. He would identify vulnerable elderly residents, those without close family, those beginning to show signs of confusion, those with modest but substantial savings. His position as publican provided perfect cover for frequent visits, offering companionship to lonely pensioners while gradually gaining their complete trust. The poison was administered through bottles of tonic he claimed would help their various ailments, the doses carefully calculated to mimic the natural decline of advanced age. The anonymous letters were his masterstroke, Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. By creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout the village, he diverted attention from his primary activities while simultaneously gathering information about potential victims and their vulnerabilities. Character resolutions and healing. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after Slack departed, bringing with him the weary satisfaction of someone whose professional suspicions had been vindicated at terrible cost. He accepted whiskey rather than tea, standing by the window with the restless energy of a man still processing the magnitude of what had been uncovered. "I should have acted more decisively when the pattern first became apparent," he said heavily. 3 deaths presenting with similar symptoms, all under Tom's supposed care. The signs were there if I'd been willing to see them clearly. Miss Marple's voice carried gentle reassurance. "You did act, Doctor. You commissioned the investigation that ultimately exposed the truth. Walter died helping you gather that evidence, which transforms his sacrifice from mere tragedy into meaningful justice." Clara Mallow's visit that afternoon brought the young woman's story to its proper conclusion. Her inheritance documents had been successfully filed, her financial future secured, but the knowledge that Walter had died while carrying those papers clearly weighed on her conscience. She sat by Miss Marple's fire, her earlier desperation replaced by tentative relief mixed with lingering guilt. "I keep thinking that if I'd been less focused on my own troubles, I might have noticed something suspicious about Tom's behavior," Clara confessed, accepting tea with hands that no longer trembled with anxiety. "He was always so helpful, so interested in everyone's business. I thought he was simply being neighborly." Tom Ginch spent years cultivating that reputation, precisely so people would think exactly that, Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. "You mustn't blame yourself for failing to see through a deception that fooled the entire village. True kindness doesn't advertise itself quite so persistently, but it takes considerable experience to recognize that distinction." Miss Marple's reflections. As the winter afternoon faded into early evening, Miss Marple sat alone by her fire, reflecting on the case and its broader implications. Tom Ginch had represented a particularly insidious form of evil. Not the passionate crime of a moment's fury, but the calculated exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. He had murdered 3 elderly people slowly and methodically, viewing their deaths as merely unfortunate necessities in his pursuit of modest financial gain. Walter Finch's murder had been different, born of panic when his careful scheme faced exposure. The postman's methodical nature and intimate knowledge of village correspondence had made him uniquely dangerous to Tom's enterprise. Walter had noticed the patterns in anonymous letters, observed Tom's frequent visits to elderly residents, connected the timing of deaths with changes in estate management. His questions to Dr. Haydock about poisons hadn't been theoretical speculation, but careful investigation based on genuine suspicion and moral courage. Village recovery and renewal. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead began the slow process of healing from the revelation that one of their own had been systematically murdering vulnerable residents. Mrs. Bantry organized a memorial service for Walter Finch, determined to honor his decades of faithful service and his final act of heroism. The post office appointed a reliable replacement, ensuring that the vital communications of village life would continue flowing with their accustomed regularity. Even Major Palgrave seemed transformed by recent events, openly discussing his financial difficulties and working to resolve them rather than hiding behind bluster and denial. The crisis had stripped away pretense, revealing both the capacity for evil and the strength of community bonds when tested by genuine adversity. Thematic closure. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily as she worked on the grey scarf for her nephew Raymond, the familiar rhythm providing comfort in the aftermath of chaos. Through her sitting room window, she could see the village settling into its evening routines. Lights appearing in cottage windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the eternal patterns of domestic life reasserting themselves after disruption. The case had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous people were often those who seemed most helpful, most concerned with others' welfare. Tom Ginch had weaponized the village's trust, turning the very qualities that made community life possible, neighborly concern, respect for helpful service, faith in familiar institutions, into tools for exploitation and murder. Yet the investigation had also revealed the power of careful observation and moral courage. Walter Finch had refused to ignore troubling patterns, even at the cost of his life. Dr. Haydock had persisted with his suspicions despite social pressure to accept convenient explanations. Miss Marple herself had demonstrated that truth, however carefully concealed, would eventually emerge through patient attention to human nature and its consistent patterns. As snow continued falling outside her window, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead's innocence had been permanently altered, replaced by a harder wisdom about the capacity for evil that could lurk behind the most ordinary facades. Christmas had come and gone, marked forever by tragedy and revelation. But the village would endure, strengthened by the knowledge that vigilance was the price of safety and that the most important truths were often found in the smallest details of human behavior. The postman who never reached Christmas morning had, in his final service to the community, ensured that justice would ultimately prevail over even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The inquest into Walter Finch's death convened on the 2nd day of January in the wood-paneled courtroom above the council offices at Much Benham. Miss Marple attended with quiet dignity, positioned where she could observe the proceedings while remaining unobtrusive among the gathered villagers. The formal atmosphere seemed almost anticlimactic after the dramatic revelations of Christmas Eve, yet she understood the importance of legal closure for a community still reeling from betrayal. Tom Ginch's comprehensive confession, supported by the toxicology reports and Walter's hidden evidence from the church vestry, left the coroner little room for deliberation. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against Tom Ginch within 20 minutes, accompanied by a formal commendation recognizing Walter's conscientious discharge of duty and exceptional courage in protecting his community. Miss Marple thought the official language rather inadequate to capture Walter's true heroism, but she was gratified that his sacrifice received public acknowledgement. Resolving the final details. The week following the inquest brought Peter Lake to Miss Marple's door, with a discovery that illuminated the last remaining mysteries of the case. He carried a small leather-bound notebook that had been concealed in Walter's locker at the sorting office, tucked behind his spare uniform boots with the careful precision of someone who understood the value of hidden evidence. Walter kept far more detailed records than anyone realized. Peter explained, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with obvious relief at finally sharing this burden. This was his personal investigation log, separate from his official route book. Miss Marple examined the notebook with fascination, reading Walter's methodical observations about village correspondence patterns, his growing suspicions about Tom Ginch's activities, and his careful documentation of the anonymous letter campaign. An entry dated November 14th proved particularly illuminating. T.G. visiting Mrs. Carmichael daily. Claims she needs tonic. Letters from solicitor ceased arriving 2 weeks ago. Must speak to Dr. H. about symptoms. He was building a comprehensive case, Miss Marple observed with admiration, gathering evidence systematically before making accusations that could destroy an innocent man's reputation. The notebook also solved the puzzle of how Tom had produced the anonymous letters without detection. Walter had noted T.G. using old machine in vestry after choir practice, typing late at night, sound carries across churchyard. Tom had exploited his volunteer work at the church to access the ancient typewriter in the vestry, using the community's trust in his helpfulness to mask his criminal activities. Community healing and transformation. As January progressed, St. Mary Mead began the delicate process of rebuilding trust and normalcy. The Blue Boar remained shuttered, its swinging sign creaking mournfully in the winter wind until the brewery installed a temporary manager. The villagers found themselves reassessing years of interactions with Tom Ginch, recognizing in hindsight the subtle manipulations they had dismissed as neighborly concern. Mrs. Price Ridley, encountering Miss Marple near the church one afternoon, expressed the collective sense of disillusionment that permeated the village. "I allowed that man into my home to discuss parish accounts," she said with visible distress. "He sat in my drawing room, drinking my tea while plotting murder. It makes one question everything one thought one knew about people. Evil often wears the most pleasant mask, Miss Marple replied gently. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous and why Walter's vigilance was so crucial. Dr. Haydock reported that several villagers had sought his counsel, troubled by their inability to detect Tom's true nature despite years of interaction. The doctor prescribed time and patience, explaining that the capacity to trust, even when occasionally betrayed, remained essential to community life. Walter's legacy. Clara Mallow's final gesture before departing St. Mary Mead provided a meaningful conclusion to her character arc and a fitting memorial to Walter's sacrifice. She established a scholarship fund in Walter's name for village children seeking educational opportunities beyond their family's means, transforming her inherited wealth into something that would benefit the community Walter had died protecting. It feels like the only way to create something good from this tragedy, Clara explained to Miss Marple as she prepared to return to London. Walter's death indirectly saved my inheritance, and I want that money to serve others as faithfully as he served the village. Miss Marple found this gesture particularly appropriate, reflecting Walter's own dedication to service and his understanding that individual actions could profoundly impact an entire community. Miss Marple's final reflections. As winter deepened and the village settled into new rhythms, Miss Marple often paused during her constitutional walks at the bridge where Walter had fallen. The spot had become a place of quiet remembrance, where villagers would stop to reflect on the price of vigilance and the value of those who served without seeking recognition. The case had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous individuals were often those who appeared most helpful and trustworthy. Tom Ginch had weaponized the very qualities that made community life possible: neighborly concern, respect for helpful service, faith in familiar institutions, transforming them into tools for exploitation and murder. Yet the investigation had also revealed the power of careful observation and moral courage. Walter Finch had refused to ignore troubling patterns, even when silence would have been safer. Dr. Haydock had persisted with uncomfortable suspicions despite social pressure to accept convenient explanations. Even Peter Lake had overcome his nervousness to provide crucial assistance when truth required courage. The enduring lesson. Sitting by her fire on a particularly bitter evening, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead's innocence had been permanently altered, replaced by a harder wisdom about human nature's capacity for both good and evil. The village had learned that safety required vigilance, that trust must be balanced with discernment, and that the most important truths often emerged from the smallest details of human behavior. Christmas had passed, marked forever by tragedy and revelation, but the community would endure. The postman, who never reached Christmas morning, had, through his final act of service, ensured that justice would prevail over even the most carefully constructed deceptions. His legacy would live on, not only in the scholarship fund bearing his name, but in the renewed appreciation for those quiet guardians who watched over their communities with dedication and courage. The case was closed, but its lessons would resonate through St. Mary Mead for years to come. A reminder that evil might lurk behind the most ordinary facades, but that ordinary people, armed with observation and courage, possessed the power to expose and defeat it. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles providing comfort as snow began falling outside her window. Human nature, in all its complexity, remained the most reliable guide to truth she had ever encountered, and somewhere in the world, she was certain, another mystery was already beginning to unfold. By early March, St. Mary Mead had begun to show the first tentative signs of spring renewal, though the memory of Walter Finch's sacrifice remained woven into the village's daily fabric like a thread of silver through ordinary cloth. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair by the sitting-room window, working on a delicate lace pattern while observing the subtle transformations that marked both seasonal change and community healing. The memorial service, held on the anniversary of Walter's death, had drawn every resident of the village, filling St. Mary's Church beyond capacity. The simple brass plaque now mounted near the post office door read, "Walter Finch, he served faithfully," and Miss Marple had noticed how often people paused to touch it when collecting their correspondence. Young Timothy Wells, Walter's conscientious replacement, had embraced his predecessor's methodical approach while adding his own innovations, including a discrete system for monitoring unusual postal patterns that might indicate future criminal activity. Character transformations and healing. Dr. Haydock had thrown himself into his practice with renewed dedication, implementing protocols to ensure that no single individual could again gain excessive influence over vulnerable patients. During his weekly visits to Miss Marple, he spoke less of his guilt over missing the poisoning pattern and more of his satisfaction in protecting those who remained. Major Palgrave had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation, his earlier bluster replaced by genuine humility as he worked openly to resolve his gambling debts, finding unexpected community support for his honest approach to past mistakes. Clara Mallow's scholarship fund had already provided educational opportunities for 3 village children, transforming Walter's sacrifice into tangible hope for the next generation. Her letters from London spoke of purpose found through tragedy, of inherited wealth becoming inherited responsibility. Peter Lake, promoted to senior postal clerk, had discovered confidence through his crucial role in exposing the truth, understanding that moral courage, once exercised, became easier to summon when needed. Raymond's perspective, Raymond West's weekend visit in late March, brought both London newspapers and his characteristic mixture of cynicism and grudging admiration. Over tea, he insisted on dissecting every detail of the case with his novelist's fascination for human motivation and dramatic irony. "The frustrating thing, Aunt Jane," he declared, settling back with his cup, "is that no editor would accept such a plot. Too subtle in the wrong places, too ordinary in the right ones. Your Mr. Ginch looked exactly like what he was, a publican who discussed cricket scores and weather. Where's the dramatic revelation, the shocking transformation?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking steadily. "But Raymond, dear, that was precisely what made him so dangerous. Real evil rarely announces itself with theatrical flourishes. It wears comfortable masks and speaks in familiar voices." She paused thoughtfully. Tom Ginch succeeded because he appeared helpful rather than threatening. Only Walter, who observed patterns rather than personalities, recognized the systematic nature of his activities. "What haunts me," Raymond admitted more seriously, "isn't Tom's wickedness. One expects villains to be villainous. It's Walter's quiet heroism, 30 years of faithful service, noticing everything, saying little, then dying in a ditch because he finally spoke up. Heroes in novels are generally rather noisy about their virtue." "There are many such quiet heroes," Miss Marple replied softly. "We rarely notice them until they're gone." Final closure. Inspector Slack's final visit had brought official closure and, more surprisingly, genuine gratitude. The usually brusque inspector had acknowledged that Miss Marple's insights into human nature had proven more valuable than conventional investigative methods, admitting that his focus on physical evidence had initially obscured the psychological patterns that revealed the truth. Tom Ginch's trial had concluded with a life sentence, his comprehensive confession ensuring justice for Walter and his 3 elderly victims. The village had followed the proceedings with grim satisfaction rather than vengeful pleasure, understanding that justice served was better than revenge pursued. Enduring lessons. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the case's lasting impact. The village had learned that safety required vigilance without paranoia, trust balanced with discernment, and appreciation for those who served faithfully without seeking recognition. The distinction between authentic kindness and calculated manipulation often revealed itself through consistency over time and behavior when no one was watching. The postman who never reached Christmas morning had left a legacy extending far beyond delivered correspondence. He had reminded them that ordinary people, armed with observation and moral courage, possessed the power to expose even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Evil might wear pleasant masks and speak in helpful voices, but truth, like spring after winter, would eventually emerge through patient attention to the patterns that connected human actions to human nature. Miss Marple cast off the final stitches of her lace pattern, holding it up to catch the last light from her window. Like her knitting, life continued one careful stitch at a time, each day adding to the larger pattern of community, memory, and hope. The case was closed, but its lessons would resonate through St. Mary Mead for generations, a quiet testament to the eternal struggle between good and evil, and the power of ordinary courage to tip the balance toward justice. Outside, darkness gathered over the village roofs, but lights appeared in cottage windows like small beacons of continuing life, beautifully ordinary and endlessly hopeful. The auction of Tom Ginch's effects took place on a Saturday morning in late April, drawing nearly every resident of St. Mary Mead to the cobbled courtyard behind the Blue Boar. Ostensibly, they had come to bid on furniture, glassware, and the mundane possessions of their former publican. In reality, they were participating in a ritual of collective healing, dismantling the physical remnants of evil that had masqueraded as neighborly concern for nearly 2 years. Miss Marple positioned herself near the back of the crowd, her trained eye observing both the proceedings and her neighbors' reactions. The auctioneer, a brisk professional from Much Benham, moved efficiently through lots of bar stools and kitchen implements, but the atmosphere grew heavy when he lifted a delicate porcelain shepherdess with a chipped bonnet. "Lot 42, he announced, a decorative figurine, slightly damaged but of good quality. The silence that followed was profound. Every villager recognized the piece as Mrs. Carmichael's beloved possession, stolen along with her life and savings. To bid seemed like participating in the original theft. 5 shillings, Miss Marple said clearly, breaking the uncomfortable tension. The brief bidding war that followed ended quickly, dealers from London unable to match the moral weight behind Miss Marple's determination. As she wrapped the rescued shepherdess carefully in her handkerchief, she felt a deep sense of justice being restored, not through courts or punishment, but through simple acts of remembrance and respect. Village renewal and character. Resolutions. The weeks following the auction had brought remarkable news from various quarters. Clara Mallow's letter, announcing her engagement to a respectable solicitor, had delighted Mrs. Bantry, who shared the news with obvious pleasure during her afternoon visit to Miss Marple's garden. She's planning an autumn wedding and says the scholarship fund has already helped 3 village children continue their education, Mrs. Bantry reported, settling into the wicker chair with characteristic energy. Young Timothy Wells has become quite the advocate for Walter's Memorial Fund. Indeed, the new postman had embraced his predecessor's legacy with touching dedication. His engagement to Sarah Pritchard, the vicar's niece, had provided the village with joyful news after months of processing tragedy. Peter Lake's promotion at the post office had transformed the shy clerk into a confident young man who took his responsibilities seriously, implementing discreet systems to monitor unusual postal patterns. The Blue Boar had reopened under Mrs. Fletcher's cheerful management, its atmosphere lightened considerably from Tom Ginch's calculated manipulation. Even Mrs. Price Ridley grudgingly admitted that the new shepherd's pie surpassed anything served during the previous tenure. Dr. Haydock reported that elderly residents who had withdrawn into fearful isolation were gradually re-emerging into community life, encouraged by regular social gatherings at the surgery where concerns could be discussed safely. Major Palgrave had organized a cricket match fundraiser for Walter's scholarship, his enthusiasm reflecting genuine reformation rather than social performance. Miss Marple's final reflections. walking home from the church where she had placed Mrs. Carmichael's shepherdess in the vestry near Walter's memorial plaque. Miss Marple reflected on the case's lasting impact. The village had learned to distinguish between authentic kindness and calculated manipulation, understanding that genuine service didn't advertise itself with persistent helpfulness. Tom Ginch had weaponized the very qualities that made community life possible: neighborly concern, respect for helpful service, faith in familiar institutions, transforming them into tools for systematic murder. His patient approach to poisoning elderly residents had reflected chilling calculation, qualities that might have produced genuine good had they been directed toward authentic service rather than selfish gain. Walter Finch's legacy extended far beyond the scholarship fund and memorial plaque. He had reminded St. Mary Mead that vigilance was the price of safety, that observation mattered, that faithful service deserved recognition and emulation. His 30 years of methodical attention to detail had culminated in heroism that saved lives and exposed evil, transforming ordinary postal duties into extraordinary moral courage. Enduring peace. As spring progressed toward summer, Miss Marple maintained her daily constitutional through lanes where Walter had wheeled his bicycle for 3 decades. The village showed subtle signs of genuine transformation. People lingered longer in conversations, asking substantive questions about each other's welfare rather than exchanging perfunctory pleasantries. The memorial plaque near the post office read simply, "Walter Finch." He served faithfully, and Miss Marple often noticed villagers pausing to touch it when collecting correspondence. Young Timothy's cheerful whistle echoed Walter's own as he completed his rounds with conscientious precision. Sitting by her window on a particularly golden evening, Miss Marple watched the village settle into twilight routines. The postman who never reached Christmas morning had delivered his most important message through sacrifice rather than correspondence. That truth matters, that courage counts, that ordinary people possess extraordinary power to protect their communities when they choose observation over indifference. Her knitting needles clicked steadily in the gathering dusk, marking time and creating beauty through patient, methodical attention to each individual stitch. Human nature remained endlessly fascinating in its capacity for both good and evil, but St. Mary Mead had emerged wiser without becoming cynical, vigilant without becoming paranoid, grateful for quiet heroes while remaining alert to pleasant villains. The case was closed, but its lessons would resonate through the village for generations, a quiet testament to the eternal struggle between good and evil and the power of ordinary courage to ensure that justice ultimately prevails. The first truly warm day of summer arrived in St. Mary Mead with the gentle insistence of nature reclaiming its rightful place after a harsh winter. Miss Marple's garden bloomed with particular abundance, roses climbing her cottage walls as if the earth itself was determined to balance recent darkness with an excess of beauty. Through her open sitting-room window, she could hear the cheerful whistle of Timothy Wells completing his afternoon rounds, the sound carrying no hint of the bitter cold that had accompanied Walter Finch's final morning. Raymond West arrived for his midsummer visit, bearing the inevitable questions about how village life had recovered from the scandal that had briefly captured national attention. Settling into the garden chair with his customary restless energy, he voiced the frustration that had been plaguing his novelist's sensibilities. "The thing that haunts me, Aunt Jane, is how completely ordinary it all was. Tom Ginch wasn't a criminal mastermind or tortured soul, just a publican who wanted more money and didn't mind killing neighbors to get it. Where's the dramatic grandeur in that?" Miss Marple set down her knitting with the gentle smile of someone who had been expecting precisely this question. "But Raymond, dear, that was exactly the point. Evil doesn't require grandeur to be effective. In fact, it's far more dangerous when it appears completely ordinary. Tom succeeded because he looked like everyone's helpful neighbor, not some theatrical villain." She gestured toward the village visible beyond her garden wall, where life continued with reassuring normalcy. Real wickedness wears comfortable masks and speaks in familiar voices. Walter recognized this because he understood that patterns matter more than personalities, that systematic observation reveals truths dramatic intuition often misses. The legacy continues. The afternoon brought Timothy Wells and his fiancée Sarah Pritchard, radiating the particular happiness of couples united by shared purpose. They carried news that Walter's scholarship fund had enabled Emma Price, a bright girl from a struggling family, to attend grammar school in Much Benham. Emma's mother wept when she heard, Sarah reported with obvious emotion. She said Walter had delivered their post for 15 years, always with a kind word for the children. Now he's still helping them even after death. Miss Marple watched Timothy touch the memorial plaque as they passed the post office. A ritual that had begun as nervous superstition but had evolved into something more deliberate, almost ceremonial. The gesture embodied the village's transformation, less naive than before, yet perhaps more durable in its understanding of both human frailty and human courage. Character transformations. Dr. Haydock's final visit before departing for a medical conference brought news of his ongoing work establishing protocols to recognize systematic poisoning in elderly patients. Walter's death has potentially saved lives across the country by highlighting patterns that often go unnoticed, he explained with quiet satisfaction. Major Palgrave had organized the cricket match fundraiser with genuine enthusiasm, his gambling debts nearly resolved through honest work rather than desperate schemes. Even Clara Mallow's wedding invitation, arriving with the afternoon post, represented closure and new beginnings. She would marry her. Solicitor in October, the ceremony taking place in St. Mary's Church, where Walter's memorial service had drawn the entire village. Peaceful resolution. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the stone bridge where Walter had fallen. The reeds were now lush and green, swaying in the gentle summer breeze, the stream bubbling cheerfully rather than flowing dark and freezing. Wild flowers nodded where frost had once rimed every blade of grass. Children paddled in the shallows where a good man had died. She paused at the spot with quiet respect, reflecting on the strange tapestry of village life. They were all connected, bound together by shared histories and daily exchanges of news and needs. The postman had been the weaver who kept those threads moving, carrying the joys and sorrows of St. Mary Mead in his leather satchel. Walter had died because he refused to let those threads be cut by a predator's greed. Eternal truths. Turning back toward her cottage as the church clock struck 6, Miss Marple reflected that St. Mary Mead had emerged from its ordeal wiser without becoming cynical, vigilant without becoming paranoid. The village had learned to distinguish authentic kindness from calculated manipulation, understanding that genuine service didn't advertise itself with persistent helpfulness. Walter Finch's legacy lived on not merely in the scholarship fund or memorial plaque, but in the understanding that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to protect their communities when they chose observation over indifference, courage over comfort, truth over convenient deception. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm of needles clicking in the gathering dusk. Human nature remained endlessly fascinating in its capacity for both good and evil. But she had witnessed once again that good, armed with patience and observation, would ultimately prevail. The postman who never reached Christmas morning had delivered his most important message through sacrifice. That vigilance matters, that patterns reveal truth, that ordinary courage can defeat extraordinary evil. Somewhere in the world, another mystery was already unfolding, but for now, the lights appearing in cottage windows reminded her that life continued, beautifully ordinary and endlessly hopeful, in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead.